Okay. Hello and welcome. DCTV.tv from the Republica 2016 in Berlin. My name is Banse and my next guest is Richard Sennett. Mr. Sennett, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I was just listening to your talk and I was thinking about your trilogy, Homo Faber, and where you talked about man and its tools and how important it is for man to create something and to influence his environment. And now you talked about digital tools like apps guiding us to cities.
Right.
What do you think about these kind of digital tools?
I think they could be fantastic. I think they could be very, very empowering. But unfortunately, they're being abused because they're being used as part of a kind of monopoly practice by a few firms to standardize and to routinize behavior in cities. Rather than opening up more and more choice, they're actually becoming more and more directive. And they are, there's nothing inherent in them. I mean, the thing about big data and big data sets is that it allows an infinite number of possibilities, say about where to live, where to eat, how to work, where to find jobs, and so on. But they're not being used in that kind of open way. They're being used as a kind of part of a closed system that harmonizes the city, which is to say makes it more predictable, more efficient, and so on. And what I was saying in this talk is what they're doing is disabling induction about complicated issues.
Can you provide an example for that?
Yes, I'll give you an example of it from a smart city that's in the Emirates, which is a place in which is now dying, thank God, because it's an entirely predictable, controllable environment. And people at first wanted to go to this city because they thought, you know, it's fantastic, everything will be so efficient, so on. But it's proving to be a place which is uninhabitable. Nothing happens outside the house. Everything beyond that is mechanized, ordered, routine. And people are voting with their feet. They're saying, I don't want to do that. If I'm going to live in Abu Dhabi, which is not a metropolis full of diversity, but at least there are things there which make it a more interesting and diverse city than this totally planned environment. It's not the technology that did that. It's the company that has developed the city, which is really a sort of suburb. And there's a lot of ways in which this abuse can occur. One of the saddest is to argue that we need more regulation in order to save energy. And this is an argument we're hearing in New York. We should control people's mobility more because they can't control it for themselves and they're wasteful. So since rather than trying to change people's attitudes and behavior, we're going to ration the number of cars in the city, for instance. And you can use certain forms of big data to know where people are, how often they drive into the city from outside the central core, and so on. To me, this is terrible. It's and it's a kind of abuse, not only of people's desire to have freedom, but of their ability to think, maybe I shouldn't do this. You know, maybe I should decide that I'm going to drive less.
Yeah, that's a question I had, because I think all the old tools were about human beings being a subject, and now one has the feeling that the human being in an environment of these new tools is becoming an object. Would you say so?
I wouldn't. I wouldn't, because that putting it that way means it's the tool's fault.
All right.
I mean, it would be like blaming the scalpel for the fact that surgeons, for about 80 years after the scalpel, the sharp-bladed scalpel appeared, didn't know how to use it, and they often killed more people than they did with the old tool.
But
it's use, not the object itself, that's the problem.
All right, but some data scientists told me that they were programming algorithms and machine learning systems, and they said, well, we programmed this tool, we wrote this tool, but when we put in A, we don't know what's coming out. There's no way to predict what is coming out of this machine. So how is this the same tool as a scalpel, where you know, okay, I can use it, I can cut it, and I know what is happening and how I influence my environment. With these new algorithms, it's totally different. You don't know how you influence your environment as a human being.
Well, that's a good thing about that kind of program is open systems programming. I'm for that it produces unknown, non-linear outcomes, which are not rigidly predictable. But for instance, when you use Google Maps, you're not using that kind of algorithm. You're using an algorithm which is based on entirely different principles, which is you're here, go there. Or if you're using these hideous safety things, the algorithm is saying black people in that neighborhood, avoid it. So those are very determinate algorithms. Again, it's a question about use rather than the object itself. Open systems are a product of a kind of mathematical logic, you know, which has indeterminate outcomes. That's what they are as systems. But closed systems are what are coming to dominate the way we think about the use of technology, because closed systems are what are producing the kinds of profits, easy to use, user-friendly. Those tend to be very closed systems done like that. Friction-free systems, Facebook is a friction-free system. It's one of the most invasive technologies you could use. But it's the algorithms in it are easy to use. So that's what I say about this, is that this is a new era for Homo Faber, because he has powerful tools of communication now, but they're being used in a politically unacceptable, in my view, politically and socially unacceptable way.
And how can we strike a balance between the old tools, and how can we make use of the new tools in a way that keeps us in power?
Well, some of that is not by using the programs that those tools use. I mean, I object to Google Maps sort of on principle for that, you know. But I think it's also a question, you know, when you look on a screen, for instance, and the first thing that appears on your screen is Google favorites and so on, you should be able to automatically delete an ad that's paid for. You can't do it, right? But what you're getting is the first information that you see is the information that is the most controlled. And on a handheld, even on a handheld this size, if I were to go on here, the very first thing is what I would see is what Google wants me to see. And that means what somebody has paid Google to show me. So, you know, we need I mean, you know, there are open system, lots of open system architecture. To get into this a little more technically, the notion about this is that we'd have to use different kinds of search function technology than the search function technology we use now. That technology is owned by standardizing closed corporations. So I'm interested, look, I'm no computer guru, I'm obsessed by them, but I'm no expert. But I sort of got all this when I was at MIT, where I taught for a long time, which is that there are real implications of how we think about new tools for how we think about urban planning. And we can even either think about it in the kind of example you've given where you get an algorithm that shows you many different ways to go somewhere, you know, and might even say this is the most interesting but the most dangerous walk, or that walk is boring, but if you're scared,
more serendipity, or
well, yeah, but you know, we're removing serendipity from cities. It's what I like about this, an open system, you know, things come by, you know. If we were doing this in the studio, it would be closed. You know? So this is what I mean, what my book is about.
Yeah.
Is, I don't know, I guess because all these are techie people have been about this. But what I'm really interested in is the ways in which we're having a kind of flattening out and one-dimensional experience of urban life, where we're getting rid of the noise, the system noise, you know, the conflicts, the complexities of it, and we're choosing something else which is efficient rather than dynamic.
And what I was wondering, do you see?
You know, that's bad for human beings. They should learn. We should learn how to manage complexity. You know?
Yeah, I was wondering if you see people shifting over to a more passive mode.
I do.
And what does it make with people? Because in Homo Faber you describe how important it is to make things, to get the courage to change your environment. You see, oh, I'm a human being, I'm an active subject, I can change things, and that gives me more courage to change things. And as we are shifting to a more passive mode, and we are getting more objects of those monopolies you described, what does it make with the human beings as human beings in society?
Well, what happens is that I think in cities what is lost is the notion that people feel that they can deal with complex experience. That in order to be in control, they have to. Jakob Burckhardt once spoke about brutal simplifiers, the modern era. And he was thinking about, you know, nation states as a kind of brutal simplifier. I think that's also true in cities too. When I travel around Berlin, I can see, you know, in bits and pieces, part of a Berlin which is a very complex environment which requires people to think about the other people in that environment. And then parts of the city which are like much of the Mitte, which require no thought about anything. You know, which are really simplified.
And why is it a problem?
It's a problem because if you can't manage physical complexity, and thinking about physical complexity, you can't manage social complexity, and I would say ultimately psychological complexity.
And that means?
And that means that when you're faced with something that you can't control, that you can't reduced to its component parts, that rather than walk away with it, you stay engaged. And I'd say ultimately, even psychologically, I think that's what adulthood is about. That faced with things you know that are difficult and complex, you don't withdraw and retreat. In other words, you don't become an American.
This brings me to another interesting point, because I think digitization, Airbnb, all the apps, has made us to urban nomads. People can move for 3 months. They can live for 3 months in Berlin, 3 months in New York, 3 months in London, and it's very easy to move around. And my impression is, well, if I don't like it in Berlin, if it's too complex, I'm not stuck here. I'm not forced to change my environment because I don't like it. But I can move away. I can move to New York and live there, and if it's too complicated there, I go to the Philippines or to Brazil. And I was wondering, how does this change our societies if people are not stuck there anymore and forced to change what they don't like in a democratic way, but they can say, well, I can work wherever I want, I can live wherever I want, I can communicate wherever I want, so I move away from the problems.
Yeah, but I would say, with all respect, this is a very elite view. If you were a nurse, and you didn't like your job, there are very few places that you couldn't just say, I give up my job, you know, I'll find something else. Maybe in the Philippines I can be a nurse. You couldn't do that. I mean, you know, this is one of the, it's another subject, but the notion that a flexible economy would make people more flexible turns out not to be true, because you're not going to go, I'm saying if you're at your level maybe, but if you're a manual worker or something like that, you can't afford to be flexible, you know. And I mean, I use Airbnb myself. It's wonderful, but it's not a model for how people. The problem in cities is, I would say, for most people, just the opposite. That they're stagnant. They're paralyzed in it because the economy is not set up for them. It's set up for only this 20%. And the notion that everybody is a freely mobile citizen is, I say this with all respect,
yeah, of course.
But I just think it's a fantasy.
And even in the future, when all the jobs get, I don't know, digitized and done by robots and done by algorithms?
That's another story. I mean, it comes back to something that I'm going to talk about here in a month, which is that my team and I have actually been studying what kinds of jobs are growing. And you know, they're skilled labor jobs. It's amazing. There are some jobs that can't be robotized.
For example?
Well, for example, taking care of old people, nursing old people. In the high-tech sector, we were very surprised to find that in biotech, it's actually growing craft jobs, you know, because it's just very labor-intensive to do biotech research. So there are aspects of that. It's not an entirely bleak picture, but it's certainly true in Europe that there is going to be a shortage of labor, and the answer to that, you know, is job sharing. It's not an unsolvable problem. You know, we can do what the Dutch experimented with and dropped when the conservatives came in. You give somebody a half a job, and then instead of them, you know, they're on benefits the other half, but they're at work, they have that self-respect. You give them a basic minimum income, but you divide up jobs, and many of them can be done that. Instead of a street sweeper sweeping the streets 45 hours a week, they sweep it 15 or 18. So you've got 3 people working part-time. And that, I think we could do. It worked for the Netherlands. You know, it requires a lot of state intervention.
And what kind of human capabilities cannot be digitized and not be done by robots and algorithms?
Music.
Robots can write articles, robots can write poems, robots can...
Would they be any good?
Wow.
Would there be an audience? That is, if you were listening to, just take the musical example, if it was all coming out of a machine, would you go to a concert hall to listen to a machine spew this out?
Pardon?
If all that electronic music were just being written by a computer, would you go to a concert hall, turn the computer on, 2 hours later go home and say, it was a wonderful concert? You know? I mean, there's lots of things like that. You can't get a divorce by computer if you're in conflict. I mean, you know, it's not an either or thing. But I do think in Europe what we're going to have is a shrinkage of jobs, and the answer to that is not to fear machines, but to figure out how to distribute the work we do have. And part of this, since you got me going on this, I'll tell you about this. I would like to see us shrink the number of kids going to universities and get kids going to more technical schools and so on. I think there's something it's a very capitalist idea that you tell everybody, well, there's a 1 in 20 chance you can become a doctor. So why don't you take a pre-medical training and see if you're the 1 of the 20, which leaves the other 19 with nothing. You know, and there's a kind of way in which this kind of elitism means that we're disabling what a lot of kids can do. We treat manual labor as something shameful, you know, skilled. You're better, you Germans are better on that than we Brits. But same thing in France, you know, these technical colleges are dying, and there's a labor shortage among young people of 14, some places 19, 20%. Why do this? I'm going to have to stop. I'm suddenly really tired. Do you mind?
Stop, like interview stopping?
Yeah, do you mind?
No, if you're tired. That's,
I am tired.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thanks so much for your time then.
Maybe I'd come back tomorrow or something.
All right,
Saskia.
okay.
Is that
No
okay?
problem.
I just suddenly feel...
Okay, I know, it's the biorism.
Yeah, well, it's a long... I don't know what it is. It's actually earlier. I've come from New York via London.
All right,
so
no problem.
I'm sort of fading.
Fine. Richard Sennett, thank you so much for your time.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for watching. This was Richard Sennett on DCTP.tv from the Republica 216. My name is Philip Banse. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.